In the winter of 1946, the United States Navy sent one of the largest fleets ever assembled toward the bottom of the world. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, nearly 5,000 men, an icebreaker, a submarine, and an aircraft carrier, all pointed at a frozen, empty continent that no nation on Earth actually owned. The public was told it was a training exercise. Officially, it was called Operation High Jump, and it remains, to this day, the largest single expedition ever sent to Antarctica. For nearly 80 years, that operation has attracted a swirl of legend around it. Secret Nazi bases, hidden civilizations, flying discs, a diary supposedly kept by the man who led it, describing a lost world beneath the ice. Almost none of that is true, and where it comes from is, honestly, a more interesting story than the myth itself. But strip away the invented parts, and what's left is a genuinely dramatic, well-documented piece of Cold War history, built around one of the most driven and complicated men America ever sent south. That man was Richard Byrd Jr., and to understand Operation High Jump, you first have to understand him. Byrd was born in 1888 into one of Virginia's oldest and most politically connected families, and from an early age he was, by every account from people who knew him, someone who could not stand to come in second at anything. He joined the Navy and found in aviation, still a young and genuinely dangerous field in those years, exactly the kind of frontier a man like him needed. In 1926, Byrd announced that he had flown over the North Pole, becoming, in the eyes of the American public, the first human being to look down on the top of the world. He was awarded the Medal of Honor and became a national hero almost overnight. It's worth noting, in the interest of accuracy, that serious doubts about that specific claim have circulated among historians and aviation experts for decades since, centered on questions about his flight's actual navigation logs and whether his aircraft could plausibly have covered the necessary distance in the recorded time. Some Byrd biographers and polar historians now believe he may have turned back before actually reaching the pole. At the time, though, none of that controversy had surfaced, and the nation wanted a hero. Byrd gave them exactly that. He followed the North Pole flight with a transatlantic crossing, and then, in 1929, with a flight over the South Pole, becoming the first person to fly over both poles of the Earth. New York gave him not one but 3 ticker tape parades. But it was Antarctica specifically that took hold of him and never let go. In 1928, he led an ambitious expedition to the continent and established a base on the Ross Ice Shelf that he named, with characteristic confidence, Little America. From there, his men flew across a continent almost no one had properly mapped, filling in blank spaces that had been little more than guesswork for a century. He returned in the early 1930s for a second expedition, and it was on that trip that Byrd did something that revealed just how singular and driven he actually was. He chose to spend the deep Antarctic winter completely alone, manning a remote weather station roughly 100 miles from his main base for nearly 5 months in continuous polar darkness. It very nearly killed him. The stove and generator keeping him alive were also, unknown to him, slowly poisoning him with carbon monoxide. Over weeks, he grew progressively weaker and more disoriented, barely able to operate his radio, his only link to the outside world. When his men finally realized something was seriously wrong and fought their way across the ice to reach him, they found him gaunt and near death. He survived, and by his own later account, and the accounts of people close to him, he came back from that winter a changed man, marked by something he struggled to fully put into words for the rest of his life. This part of the story is genuinely documented, both in Byrd's own writing, in his memoir alone, and in the accounts of expedition members. It's one of the most harrowing survival stories in the history of polar exploration, and it needs no embellishment to be extraordinary. By the time World War II ended, Byrd was one of the most famous men in America. A decorated officer with a personal friendship with President Franklin Roosevelt and deep connections throughout the Navy's senior leadership. And it was Byrd, more than anyone else, who pushed the Navy to mount a massive new Antarctic expedition once the war was over. He personally lobbied Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal and Chief of Naval Operations Chester Nimitz to authorize what would become Operation High Jump, and Congress approved the funding. On paper, and in Byrd's own public statements at a November 1946 press conference, the mission had 2 stated goals: to train naval personnel and test ships, aircraft, and the Navy's new helicopters under extreme cold weather conditions, and to expand scientific knowledge of the continent's geography, geology, weather, and magnetic properties. Both of those things were genuinely true. But historians who have studied the operation's internal planning documents have identified real, additional motives that were never fully disclosed to the public at the time, and which help explain why a supposed training and research mission arrived with a warship task force instead of a handful of scientists. The Cold War had just begun, and it shaped High Jump's real purpose more than the official press releases let on. The United States and the Soviet Union were both eyeing the polar regions with genuine strategic anxiety, worried about the other side developing the capacity to strike over the North Pole, and Antarctica, entirely unclaimed by any nation and rumored to sit atop significant mineral deposits, including possible uranium, was suddenly a place worth securing a foothold in before anyone else could. Declassified planning documents and later historical analysis have confirmed that part of the Navy's actual orders was to lay the groundwork for a future American territorial claim in Antarctica, something that was explicitly classified at the time specifically so it wouldn't provoke other nations or draw public criticism. There was also a more mundane bureaucratic motive. Some historians who have studied the operation, including those interviewed by the Smithsonian, believe High Jump was also intended, at least in part, to demonstrate the Navy's continued relevance and capability to a Truman administration that was actively looking to cut the military budget after the war. In other words, this was a genuinely multi-layered operation, driven by science, by Cold War strategy, by territorial ambition, and by inter-service politics, all wrapped inside a public story about cold weather training. None of that required aliens or a hidden Nazi base to be interesting. It was already a Navy quietly racing to plant a flag on the last unclaimed continent on Earth before the Soviets got the same idea. The scale of the operation, once it actually launched in December 1946, was genuinely unprecedented. Task Force 68, as it was formally designated, included 13 ships organized into several groups, an aircraft carrier, an icebreaker, and, remarkably, a submarine sent along specifically to test whether it could operate effectively in Antarctic waters, something no one had seriously attempted before. Nearly 5,000 men took part, supported by helicopters used in Antarctica for the first time in history. Byrd, though technically retired from active command by that point, was placed in charge of the task force as officer in charge, while Rear Admiral Richard Byrd held the actual operational command of the naval forces. It was, by any measure, the largest and most heavily resourced Antarctic expedition ever assembled, before or since. And yet, despite all that planning and all that firepower, the mission that had been announced as a 6 to 8 month operation was over in a matter of weeks. Ships began withdrawing from the Antarctic in February 1947, roughly 8 weeks after the main force had arrived, and the operation was formally terminated by the end of that month. This is where the real historical record, not the invented conspiracy version, actually gets genuinely interesting, because the true reason for that early withdrawal remains debated among historians, even without resorting to any talk of secret battles with advanced aircraft. The official explanation given at the time was the early approach of the Antarctic winter and rapidly worsening weather and ice conditions, which made continued operations increasingly dangerous. That explanation is broadly accepted by most historians as the primary factor, and it lines up with the genuine, well-documented hazards of trying to operate a large naval fleet in polar waters as the seasonal ice began closing in faster than anticipated. Byrd himself, in later interviews, spoke candidly about what the operation had taught the Navy about the practical limits of operating in that environment, describing lessons learned about cold weather equipment failures, disorientation, and the sheer difficulty of coordinating a force that size in such a hostile, poorly charted place. At the same time, several credible historians and participants have also described the operation as somewhat disorganized in practice, despite its impressive scale on paper. One Navy pilot who flew our 4D transport aircraft during the mission, Conrad Gus Shin, said candidly in later interviews that many of the men genuinely weren't sure what they were doing or precisely what they were looking at from the air, describing confusion about specific objectives that never quite matched the operation's grand official framing. 2 helicopters were lost during the mission, and the operation, for all its ambition, ultimately fell well short of its own stated goals for mapping the continent's coastline. None of that needed a cover-up to explain. Large, hastily assembled post-war military operations, planned in a matter of months and thrown into one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet, often run into exactly this kind of friction. It's a very human, very believable explanation, and it happens to be the one that's actually backed up by the documentary record. Ship logs, press coverage from journalists who were embedded with the fleet, and the personal accounts of servicemen who were there. That last detail matters enormously, and it's exactly the part that the popular conspiracy version of this story consistently leaves out. Operation High Jump wasn't some deniable black operation carried out in secrecy. It sailed with journalists on board, including Lee Van Atta of International News Service, who filed real-time newspaper dispatches from the fleet throughout the mission. Every flight was logged by Navy record keepers and tracked. Byrd gave press conferences before, during, and after the expedition. This was, by the standards of the era, an unusually well-publicized military operation, not a shadowy one. That level of contemporaneous documentation is precisely why the various legends that grew up around High Jump in the decades since don't hold up well against the historical record. The most persistent of those legends centers on a document known as Byrd's Secret Diary, which purports to describe a solo flight Byrd made over the North Pole in February 1947, during which he claimed to have flown into a hidden opening at the pole leading to a lush, green interior world populated by an advanced civilization, complete with glowing crystal cities and flying disc-shaped aircraft. According to the legend, the inhabitants of this hidden realm, sometimes named in these retellings as the Ariani, warned Byrd about the dangers of nuclear weapons before sending him back to the surface, after which the U.S. government supposedly suppressed his account for decades. It's a genuinely striking piece of fiction, and it has circulated in books, documentaries, and online videos for decades. But it does not survive even basic fact-checking, and independent researchers, historians, and fact-checking organizations who have investigated it have reached the same conclusion. It is not authentic. The dates alone make it geographically and physically impossible. In February 1947, Byrd was verifiably in Antarctica, at the opposite end of the planet from the North Pole, commanding a fleet of thousands of men aboard the command vessel USS Mount Olympus, an assignment documented in ship's logs, press dispatches, and the accounts of the hundreds of people around him at the time. He was never alone or missing during that period, and the diary's claim of a solitary flight over a sunlit green Arctic landscape in February directly contradicts the basic fact that the North Pole in February sits in the middle of total polar night, wrapped in months of continuous darkness. The writing style of the diary itself, researchers have also noted, bears no resemblance to Byrd's actual well-documented prose, which was formal, technical, and restrained. The diary instead reads like the dramatic, pulp adventure writing style popular in men's fiction magazines decades after Byrd's actual career. The Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center, the academic institution that holds much of Byrd's genuine archival material today, has stated plainly that it possesses no record supporting the diary's existence or authenticity, despite receiving regular inquiries about it. Most researchers who have traced its origin believe it emerged sometime in the 1960s or 1970s, evolved through the same kind of speculative retelling that produced other Cold War-era Hollow Earth folklore, and was later attached to Byrd's genuinely famous name because a real, decorated national hero lent the story a credibility a purely invented character never could have carried on its own. So why does the myth persist, when the real documentary record so clearly contradicts it? Partly because Operation High Jump really was unusually large, really did end unusually early, and really was publicly justified with an official explanation, cold weather training, that plainly understated its actual, more complicated Cold War motives around territorial claims and strategic positioning. That gap between the stated purpose and the fuller, declassified picture historians have since pieced together is real, and it's understandable that a genuine, documented gap like that creates fertile ground for speculation to grow in. The difference is that the real, complicated truth, a navy quietly racing to establish a strategic and territorial foothold on an unclaimed continent believed to hold valuable resources, worried about Soviet ambitions in the same region, while publicly framing the whole thing as routine training, is itself a legitimately fascinating piece of Cold War history. It doesn't need aliens, hidden Nazi remnants, or a lost civilization beneath the ice to be worth telling. If anything, dressing it up with those inventions distracts from what's genuinely compelling about it. how much of early Cold War military strategy played out not through direct confrontation, but through this kind of quiet, deniable positioning in places the public barely paid attention to. As for Byrd himself, he continued his public career for years afterward, remaining a prominent figure in American polar exploration and returning to Antarctica one more time in the 1950s as part of Operation Deep Freeze, the operation that helped establish the permanent U.S. scientific presence in Antarctica that continues to this day. He died in 1957, still widely regarded, whatever the later controversies over his 1926 North Pole claim, as one of the most significant figures in the history of polar exploration. The genuine complexity of his life, the relentless ambition, the real physical ordeal of his solitary winter alone on the ice, the political maneuvering behind Operation High Jump, and the way his fame was later hijacked by a fabricated diary he never actually wrote, is a far richer and more human story than the version built around secret alien encounters. It's the story of a man who spent his entire life trying to be first into places no one else had gone, who nearly died proving it to himself in 1934, and who ended up, without ever intending to, becoming the namesake of one of the 20th century's most durable pieces of internet folklore, attached to a document that historians can trace, refute, and date with far more confidence than they can most conspiracy theories. The honest lesson in all of this isn't that nothing strange or classified ever happened in Antarctica during the Cold War. Genuine territorial ambitions, genuine resource speculation, and genuine strategic secrecy around a newly former war really did shape Operation High Jump's true, only partially disclosed objectives, and that part of the story is well supported by historians and by documents that have since come to light. What isn't supported by any credible archival evidence is the idea that Byrd flew into a hidden world beneath the ice, encountered an advanced civilization, or spent the rest of his life suppressing a secret too dangerous for the public to know. That version of the story was built decades after the fact, attached to a famous man's name because it needed his credibility to feel believable, and it has persisted mostly because it's simply a better story than a Cold War military operation understated its own objectives in a press release. Even though the real, documented version of events is, on its own terms, still a genuinely remarkable piece of 20th century history. It's also worth asking why this particular myth, out of all the conspiracy theories that circulate about the 20th century, has proven so durable. Part of the answer is Antarctica itself. It remains, even now, the one continent on Earth where ordinary people have almost no direct experience to check a claim against. Most viewers have stood in a city, driven through a desert, or seen mountains with their own eyes, which gives them some intuitive basis for spotting an exaggeration. Almost no one has stood on the polar ice cap, which means a confident, detailed description of what's supposedly hidden beneath it faces very little instinctive skepticism from an audience. Add a real historical figure with genuine, verifiable heroism to his name, a real operation that genuinely was unusually large and genuinely did end earlier than announced, and you have all the raw material a myth needs to feel plausible, even though every specific, checkable claim built on top of that raw material turns out not to hold up. That's really the pattern worth remembering, not just for this story but for how these kinds of legends get built in general. The myth doesn't usually invent its setting from nothing. It borrows a real person, a real operation, and a real, documented gap between what was publicly announced and what was privately intended, and then fills that gap with something far more dramatic than the truth actually was. Byrd's life supplies plenty of genuine drama on its own. The disputed North Pole flight, the medals, the ticker tape parades, and above all those 5 months alone in the Antarctic dark, slowly being poisoned by his own stove while the world back home believed he was simply out of radio contact. None of that needs an invented diary to be compelling. If anything, knowing the real story makes the fabricated one feel smaller, a costume draped over a man whose actual life was already strange, driven, and difficult enough to earn its place in history without any embellishment at all.